The laminated card was still in my bag when my mother said it, right there in front of Mrs. Lem. Patel, in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet cleaner.
Audrey has always been unreliable, Marcia said, not even lowering her voice, like I was a rumor and not a person sitting 3 feet away. We should have known better than to let her handle something this important. Rob nodded along, arms crossed, playing the disappointed father like it was a part he'd rehearsed. Dean sat there with his tie a little too tight, saying nothing, which was its own kind of lie. Miss Patel looked at me, not at them. At me, and she had a folder in her hands that I recognized because I was the one who had built the system that filled it. I didn't say a word. I let my mother finish digging. If you've ever sat in a room and watched your own family hand you the blame for someone else's mistake, hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments how long you stayed quiet before you finally let the truth speak for you. My name is Audrey Lane. I'm 40 years old, and for 11 years, I was the operations scheduler for Lane Commercial Cleaning, a family business my parents built from a single van and a handshake with a strip mall dentist's office back in the 90s. By the time I came on full-time, we had 18 accounts, 40 employees, and one client that mattered more than all the others combined, Halbrook Medical Plaza. A 6-building complex on the north side of Columbus with round-the-clock cleaning needs, strict compliance requirements, and a facilities director named Priya Patel who did not tolerate excuses. I was the one who kept Halbrook happy for 8 straight years. Not my father, who liked to shake hands and talk about the old days. Not my mother, who handled the books and liked to remind people she handled the books. And certainly not my brother Dean, who came on as operations manager 4 years ago with an MBA, a haircut that cost more than my monthly parking, and a habit of treating every system I'd built like it was something quaint he'd stumbled across in his grandmother's attic. I want you to understand something before I go further. I loved this business. I loved the 2 a.m. phone calls when a night cruise van broke down and I had to reroute 3 teams before dawn. I loved the whiteboard in my office with its color-coded magnets, one color per building, one color per shift, a system so precise that Miss Patel once told me Halbrook's own internal ops team asked to see how I did it. I built that whiteboard by hand over 6 years. It wasn't decoration. It was the nervous system of a company that couldn't afford to fail, even once. Because in commercial cleaning, once is often the only chance you get. So let me take you back, because you need to see how this happened. Before you understand why I stayed silent in that room, the first thing you should know is that my parents never really saw me as an employee. They saw me as a daughter who happened to be useful. There's a difference, and it's the kind of difference that eats you slowly, one small dismissal at a time. I remember a Sunday dinner about a year before everything fell apart at my parents' house on the east side. The one with the chipped porcelain rooster on the windowsill that had been there since I was a kid. Dean was talking about streamlining, a word he used a lot that year, like it was a magic charm. "We're bleeding money on redundant shift overlaps," Dean said, cutting into his pot roast like the conversation was already decided. "Audrey's scheduling model is overcautious. We can cut 2 positions per building and nobody will notice." "They'll notice," I said. "Halbrook's contract has minimum staffing clauses. It's in Section 4 of the service agreement." "Nobody reads Section 4, Audrey." "I read Section 4. I wrote half our compliance checklist off Section 4. Rob waved a hand like he was swatting a fly. "Let your brother handle the strategy. You handle the calendars." That was the sentence that told me everything. You handle the calendars.
11 years of 80-hour weeks of building a scheduling system so tight that Halbrook's compliance auditors used to compliment it by name, reduced to calendars, like I was arranging birthday reminders. The second object I want you to picture is a manila folder, the kind with a rubber band around it, sitting on the corner of my desk. Inside was every service log from Halbrook going back 3 years, printed and dated because Ms. Patel's own facilities department required a paper trail for their insurance audits. I kept that folder updated religiously. It was the closest thing I had to a diary of my working life. Page after page of on-time arrivals, signed satisfaction forms, 0 missed shifts. When Dean started making unilateral changes to the schedule that spring, I began adding something new to that folder, printed copies of my own emails, warning him. Warning my parents that his changes were about to break something we couldn't fix. The third object was an email, dated the 14th of March. Subject line, Halbrook staffing changes, compliance risk. I wrote it at 11 at night, after Dean had quietly cut a night. Crew from 4 people to 2 at Building C without telling me. Without updating the master schedule, without checking the contract minimums, I wrote 3 paragraphs, calm, factual, no emotion, because I had learned a long time ago that emotion was the first thing my family used against me. I listed the contract clause. I listed the specific staffing minimum. I said, in plain language, that if this change went into effect as planned, we would be in breach of Section 4 by the 1st of April. I copied my father. I copied my mother. Nobody replied. The fourth object was a spreadsheet Dean sent 2 weeks later, retitled Optimized Staffing. Model Q2, which was my March schedule, with the same numbers he'd already implemented. Now dressed up with a company letterhead like it was his original idea. He sent it to my parents with a note that said, "This should improve margins significantly." He didn't send it to me. I found it because I still had access to the shared drive, which apparently nobody thought to revoke, since nobody thought I mattered enough to lock out. The fifth object was a phone, my own cell phone, buzzing on my kitchen counter on a Tuesday night in late March while I was making dinner alone. Because my husband works nights and my kids are grown and out of the house, which meant most of my suffering that year happened in an empty kitchen with nobody to see it. It was Miss Patel calling, not Dean, not my parents, but Miss Patel. Because Building C's overnight team hadn't shown up for the second time that week, and the compliance officer for the medical group upstairs was asking questions about biohazard disposal protocols not being followed on schedule. "Audrey, I need to know what's happening with your night crews," she said, and her voice had none of its usual warmth. "This is the second incident this month. I have to file a formal notice if this happens again." "I know," I said, and I meant it with a weight she couldn't have understood yet. "I've flagged this internally. It's not coming from me." I'm not asking who it's coming from. I'm asking if it's going to stop. I didn't have an answer for her that night, because the truth was, I didn't control it anymore. Dean did. And Dean didn't return my calls. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever done the work and watched someone else take the credit while you took the blame, drop a comment and tell me what that person's name would be in your story. I read every one. The sixth object was a printed formal notice, the one Ms. Patel warned me about, dated the 2nd of April, sent to the general email address for Lane Commercial Cleaning. The one my mother checked once a week, if she remembered. It cited 2 missed overnight services at Building C within a 30-day period. A violation of Section 4, subsection 2 of the service agreement. It requested a corrective action plan within 10 business days.
I know this because I found it myself 3 days after it arrived, sitting
Unopened in a shared inbox nobody else bothered to check.
because nobody else did the actual work of managing that relationship.
I was the one who called Miss Patel to acknowledge it. I was the one who drafted a corrective action plan that night at my kitchen table, on my own time, unpaid. Because some part of me still believed the company was worth saving, even if my family didn't act like it. I sent that corrective action plan to my parents and to Dean the next morning, along with a message that read, in part, "This is the third time I've raised this specific issue. I am not able to guarantee client satisfaction if staffing decisions continue to bypass the documented schedule. Please advise before I submit this response to Hallbrook." Dean's reply came within the hour. "You're overreacting. I'll handle Patel." He didn't handle Patel. He never called her. 2 weeks later, another missed shift, this time at a different building. And this time, no corrective plan was submitted at all. Because Dean assumed it would fix itself, the way people who've never done the actual work always assume things will fix themselves. I want to tell you about the seventh object, because it's the one that finally broke something loose in me. It was a birthday card. My birthday, the 18th of April, sitting on the kitchen counter of my parents' house when I stopped by after work. Marcia had bought a card for Dean's daughter's birthday, too. A bigger one. Glittery. The kind that plays a tune when you open it. Mine was small, plain, the kind you buy in bulk from the drugstore. Inside, it said, "Happy birthday. Love, Mom and Dad," in my mother's handwriting. Nothing else. No note. No mention of the 11 years I'd spent making sure their business didn't fall apart. I stood in that kitchen holding 2 cards, one glittery and musical, one small and silent. And I understood something about my place in that family that I had been trying not to understand for a very long time. I didn't cry. That's the strange thing. I just felt something settle in me, cold and clear, like a window opening in a stuffy room. That night, I went home and I opened a new folder on my laptop. I named it, simply, Documentation. I moved every email, every service log, every warning I had ever sent into that folder, organized by date. I printed copies and put them in a physical binder too, because I had learned enough by then to know that digital records can disappear. But a binder sitting in your own house is harder to argue away. This was the cold, calm pivot, though I didn't have a name for it at the time. I stopped pleading with my family to listen to me. I stopped hoping that if I just explained it one more time, in one more meeting, with one more chart, they would finally see what I saw. Instead, I started counting. I counted every missed shift. I counted every ignored email. I counted every day between my warning and the consequence that followed it. Because I understood, somewhere in that cold, clear place, that someday somebody would need that timeline, and it was not going to be me who softened it for anyone's comfort. I called Miss Patel the next week, not as a scheduler managing a client, but almost as one professional to another. Careful, measured. "I want you to know I take this seriously," I told her. "I've documented every staffing change and every warning I've sent internally. If this continues, I want you to have a record that this wasn't a scheduling failure on my end." There was a pause on the line. "Audrey, I've worked with you for 8 years. I already know that. I've been saving your service warnings myself, actually. Every one you sent me directly, I keep. It's just good practice on my end, too." I didn't know, in that moment, how much that sentence would matter later. Miss Patel wasn't my ally because she liked me, though I think she did.
She was my ally because she was the kind of person who kept records for the same reason I did.
Because she'd learned that memory is negotiable, but paper isn't. The eighth object, and I promise this is close to the last one before I get you to the room where this story really turns, was a printed resignation letter dated the 9th of May, sitting in a plain white envelope on my desk at the office for 2 full days before I worked up the nerve to hand it to my father. I had written and rewritten it 4 times. The final version was 1 page, professional, unemotional. It cited ongoing disregard for documented compliance requirements as the reason I could no longer, in good conscience, continue in a role where my recommendations were consistently overridden without communication. I attached, as a courtesy, every warning email I had sent since March, dated and organized, a full paper trail of exactly what I had tried to prevent. I sent that same letter, word for word, as an email to my father, my mother, and my brother at 9 in the morning on the 9th of May, with a subject line that read, "Resignation, effective immediately, with documentation." My father called me 40 minutes later. "You're quitting? Now? Right when we need you most for the Halbrook renewal?" "I told you what would happen if the staffing changes continued," I said. "I put it in writing 4 times. This isn't the time for an attitude, Audrey. This isn't an attitude. It's a resignation. Read the attachments." He didn't read the attachments. I know that now because of what happened 3 weeks later. If you've ever had to put something in writing just to protect yourself from your own family, you already know why this next part matters. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and tell me down in the comments. Have you ever kept a paper trail on someone you loved? I want to be clear about something before we get to the room where my mother called me unreliable in front of the woman who had trusted me for 8 years. I did not go back to that office to gloat, and I did not go back expecting an apology. I went back because Miss Patel called me personally 2 days before the Halbrook contract renewal meeting and asked me to come. "I heard you'd resigned," she said. "I want you there anyway, not as staff, as a witness." "Patel, I don't work there anymore. I know exactly who works there and who doesn't," she said. And there was something in her voice, flat and precise, that told me she already knew more than she was saying. "I'd still like you there." So I went, 3 weeks after my last day, wearing a blazer I hadn't worn since my final week on the job, carrying a folder of my own, though I didn't plan to open it unless I had to. My mother had texted me the night before, a single line. "Try to be professional tomorrow, for once." I didn't answer. The renewal meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning in the same conference room where I'd sat through 100 meetings over the years. The one with the water stain on the ceiling tiles shaped like Florida that nobody had ever fixed. My parents were already there when I walked in, along with Dean, in his good suit, flipping through a presentation deck I recognized instantly. Because half the slides were built on formatting templates I had designed years earlier for exactly this kind of client review. Miss Patel arrived at 10 sharp, alone, with a leather folio under her arm and an expression I had learned over 8 years to read as professionally unreadable. She sat across from Dean, nodded once at my parents, and looked at me last, a small, deliberate acknowledgement that told me she knew exactly why I was in the room. Dean started strong, the way he always did, full of numbers about efficiency gains and cost optimization, sliding past the 2 compliance notices Halbrook had sent that spring like they were footnotes instead of the entire story. He talked about streamlined staffing models and improved operational agility, phrases that meant nothing, except that fewer people were cleaning more space in less time. Miss Patel let him finish.
Then she set her folio flat on the table, unopened, hands resting on top of it, and said, "Before we discuss renewal terms, I'd like to understand what happened between February and May of this year."
We received 2 formal compliance notices. Neither received a documented corrective action plan within the required window. I want to understand who was responsible for staffing decisions during that period. Silence. Rob shifted in his seat. Marcia's jaw tightened, and I watched her do the thing she always did when cornered, which was look for someone else to point at. That would have been our scheduling department, Marcia said. We had some reliability issues internally during that time. Reliability issues, Ms. Patel repeated, flat, like she was tasting a word to check if it was rotten. Audrey handled scheduling, Marcia continued. And here it came, the sentence I had been waiting 3 weeks to hear out loud in this room in front of this woman. Audrey has always been unreliable. We should have known better than to let her handle something this important. Rob nodded, arms crossed. We're implementing better oversight going forward. Dean's brought a lot of professional structure to the operation. Dean said nothing. He just sat there, hands folded, letting our parents build a story where he was the fix and I was the failure. And I understood in that moment that this had probably been the plan all along, whether spoken aloud between them or not. Blame the one who left. She's not here to argue. Except I was there, sitting 3 feet away, holding a folder I still hadn't opened. I want you to understand what it felt like, hearing my own mother call me unreliable in front of Priya Patel. A woman who had called my cell phone at 9 at night more than once over the years because she trusted me to answer. A woman who had personally recommended our company to 2 other facilities directors in the medical park, specifically because of how I ran the account. I felt something rise in my throat, hot and immediate, the old instinct to defend myself, to explain, to list every hour I'd worked and every crisis I'd solved at 2 a.m. while everyone else slept. I didn't say a word. I had promised myself, back in that cold, clear kitchen the night I opened the documentation folder, that if this moment ever came, I would let the paper speak first. Not because I was afraid, but because I had learned over 11 years in that family that anything I said in the heat of that room would be reframed as emotional, defensive, unreliable, the very word my mother had just used. So I sat still, and I let the silence stretch, and I watched Miss Patel's face. She opened her folio. I have something I'd like to read into the record of this meeting, she said, before we go any further with renewal terms. Dean's posture changed first. Just slightly, a stiffening in the shoulders that I recognized because I had watched him try to bluff through client concerns for 4 years. Miss Patel, I don't think that's necessary. We've already outlined our path forward. It's necessary, she said, without raising her voice. This is an email dated March 14th, sent to Rob Lane, Marcia Lane, and Dean Lane from Audrey Lane. Subject line, Hallbrook staffing changes. Compliance risk. She began to read it aloud, sentence by sentence, in the same even tone she used for contract clauses, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted it. I am writing to formally document a concern regarding the recent staffing change at Building C. As of this week, overnight coverage has been reduced from 4 staff to 2. Without prior notice to me, and without adjustment to the master schedule. This falls below the minimum staffing requirement outlined in Section 4, Subsection 2 of our service agreement with Hallbrook Medical Plaza. If this change remains in effect past April 1st, we will be in breach of contract. I am requesting that this change be reversed or that a formal amendment be negotiated with the client before implementation. Rob's face had gone very still. Marcia had stopped moving entirely. This is dated March 14th, Miss Patel said, looking up. The first missed overnight service at Building C occurred March 28th. The second occurred April 11th. Our formal compliance notice was sent April 2nd. I have the certified mail receipt, if anyone would like to see it. Nobody said anything. Dean's jaw was working like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. I'd also like to read the follow-up, Miss Patel continued, and I realized, with something between gratitude and grief, that she had done exactly what I had done for 8 years without anyone in my family noticing. She had kept a record, quietly, patiently, because she understood that someday the truth would need proof to survive in a room like this one. Dated April 9th. This is the third time I've raised this specific issue. I am not able to guarantee client satisfaction if staffing decisions continue to bypass the documented schedule. And finally, she said, the resignation letter, dated May 9th. With 7 attached documents outlining every warning sent between February and May of this year, addressed to Rob Lane, Marcia Lane, and Dean Lane. She closed the folio. I received a copy of that resignation letter and its attachments directly from Audrey. As a courtesy, the same day it was sent, she said. I want to be very clear about the timeline here, because I think there's been some confusion in this room about who was responsible for the compliance failures we experienced this spring. If you've ever needed someone else to say the thing you'd been saying alone for months, just so people would finally believe it, comment below and tell me who that person was for you. And if this story is landing, go ahead and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Dean tried to recover. I have to give him that. He had spent 4 years learning how to talk his way through rooms he didn't fully understand. With respect, Miss Patel, he said, staffing decisions are complex. There were budget pressures across the whole company that quarter, and Audrey's model, while thorough, wasn't always aligned with where the business needed to go financially. I don't think it's fair to frame this as... I'm not interested in framing it as anything, Ms. Patel said. I'm interested in the fact that we sent 2 formal compliance notices, and the person who received them, who is sitting at the head of this table, did not respond to either one with a corrective action plan. Meanwhile, the person you're describing as unreliable sent 4 written warnings before any of this became a compliance issue at all, and personally called our office each time a shift was missed to manage the fallout, even after handing in her resignation. That's not, Dean started. I have the call logs from our security desk, Ms. Patel said. Every call comes through the front desk before it's routed. Your sister's name is on 11 of them between February and May. Yours is on none. The room went quiet in a way I had never heard a room go quiet before, not even during the worst crises of my career. My father was staring at the table. My mother's hands were folded so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. Dean opened his mouth once more, and I watched him realize, in real time, that there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. Because the timeline had his name on it, in the gaps, in the silences, in every place where a response should have been and wasn't. I still hadn't said a word. I want you to sit with that, because it matters. I had a folder in my lap with copies of everything Ms. Patel had just read, And I could have opened it, could have added my own voice, could have said something sharp and satisfying about 11 years and one glittery birthday card. I didn't. I let the documentation carry the whole weight of it, because I had learned, finally, that the truth doesn't need my emotion to be believed. It needs a date and a signature, and a paper trail that somebody else was honest enough to keep. Patel closed the folio and looked at my parents, not unkindly, but without softness either. "I want to be direct," she said. "Holbrook Medical Plaza will not be renewing our contract with Lane Commercial Cleaning under the current management structure. We've valued this relationship for 8 years, largely because of the consistency and communication we received, historically, from Audrey. Given what I've just read into the record, I don't have confidence that consistency will continue under Dean's leadership." "Miss Patel, please," Rob said, and I heard something in his voice I had rarely heard from my father, something close to actual fear. "We can restructure. We can bring in additional oversight. This account means a great deal to us." "I understand that," she said. "But I have a responsibility to my own building tenants and to our compliance record. I can't renew based on assurances when I have 3 months of documented evidence," suggesting the assurances weren't followed the last time they were made. She stood, gathering her folio, and then she did something I didn't expect. She looked at me directly, the first time she'd addressed me since the meeting started. "Audrey, thank you for coming today. I know it wasn't an easy room to sit in." "Thank you for keeping the record," I said. And that was the only thing I said in that entire meeting. She left. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a long moment, nobody in that conference room said anything at all. Then Marcia turned to me, and I want you to notice, because I noticed it immediately, that there was no apology in what came next. "Well," she said, "I hope you're satisfied." I looked at her, and something in me that had spent 40 years wanting her approval simply went quiet, like a machine finally switched off. "I warned you 4 times in writing," I said. "I'm not the one who should be satisfied or not satisfied about anything that happened in this room today." I already left. I stood up, picked up my folder, still unopened, and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. The silence I left behind was louder than anything I could have said. In the weeks after that meeting, the fallout moved through the family the way water moves through a cracked foundation, slow, quiet, finding every weak point. Halbrook was the account that had kept Lane Commercial Cleaning stable enough to carry. 3 smaller, less profitable contracts, the ones that broke even at best. Losing it wasn't a single wound. It was the kind of loss that shows up gradually, in missed payroll cycles, in vendors calling about overdue invoices, in 2 smaller clients quietly not renewing because word travels fast in a business community as small as commercial facilities management in a city like Columbus. Dean stayed on for another 4 months. I heard through my cousin, who still worked part-time doing the books, that he tried to rebuild the Holbrook relationship on his own, calling Patel directly, offering discounted rates, offering to personally oversee the account. She declined every time, politely, and finally stopped returning his calls altogether. I don't think that surprised anyone who had actually read the timeline out loud in that conference room. My father called me in September, almost 4 months after the meeting. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered it. "Audrey," he said, "we're struggling. Dean's not built for this the way you were. I know things haven't been right between us." I know we didn't listen when we should have. I waited. I had learned to wait by then for the actual point of a conversation, instead of filling silences with hope the way I used to. "We'd like to bring you back on as a consultant," he said, "to help rebuild the scheduling systems. We'd pay you fairly for it." Full consulting rate, whatever the market rate is for that kind of work. I thought about the 11 years I had given for a scheduler's salary. About the manila folder, about the whiteboard with its color-coded magnets that someone had probably taken down by now. About my mother's small, silent birthday card sitting next to Dean's daughter's musical one. "I'll consider it," I said, "at full consulting rate, with a written contract and clear boundaries on scope. And I need you to understand, Dad, this isn't me coming back into the family business. This is a business relationship." "I understand," he said. And I believed, for the first time in a long time, that he actually did. We signed a contract 2 weeks later. It was strange, sitting across from my own father at a table, negotiating rates. Like we'd never shared a last name. But it was also, in its own way, the healthiest interaction we'd had in years. I did the work. I got paid for it. I went home at the end of each day and didn't think about it until the next scheduled session, because that's what boundaries are supposed to feel like. My mother called me exactly once, in October, a short call, 4 minutes long, mostly about a mutual friend's health issue. And near the end of it, she said, "I suppose things worked out in a strange way." She didn't apologize. I want to be honest with you about that. Because I think stories like this one sometimes promise a tearful reconciliation that doesn't reflect how most families actually heal, if they heal at all. Marcia never said the words, "I'm sorry." Not that day, not since. What she offered instead was a phone call, unprompted, 4 minutes of ordinary conversation that didn't end in blame. I've learned to let that be what it is. Not an apology, but not nothing either. I keep my own calendar clean now, in every sense of the phrase. I don't wait by the phone for my mother to call. I don't check the shared family group chat for validation. I built a small consulting business out of what happened. 3 other clients now, none of them related to me. All of them paying full rate for the same systems my family once called just calendars. Dean and I don't talk much. He left the company altogether last spring, moved into a sales role somewhere unrelated, and I heard he's doing fine. Which I find I can actually be glad about, in the quiet, uncomplicated way. You're glad for someone you no longer need anything from. Miss Patel and I still have coffee sometimes, every couple of months. Not about business, just as 2 women who respect each other's habit of keeping good records. She told me once, over a cup of coffee in a shop near her new office, that she'd kept every warning I ever sent her, not because she expected to need it in a meeting like that one, but because good record keeping is just what you do when you take your work seriously. I think about that a lot. I think it's the closest thing to a compliment I received during that entire period of my life, and it came from someone outside my family. Which tells you something about where the actual respect had been living all along. I still have the folder. I keep it in a drawer in my home office, along with a few other things from that chapter of my life. And I still have the thing I want to leave you with. The object I think about more than any spreadsheet or email or missed shift log from that whole ordeal. It's a laminated card, about the size of an index card, a little worn at the corners now. On it is the night route schedule I built for Holbrook's overnight teams, back when I first started managing that account, 8 years before any of this happened. Building A, 10 p.m. Building B, 11:15. Building C, midnight, with a note about the extra time needed for the lab areas. In the bottom corner, in my own handwriting, faded but still legible, are my initials.
A.L. I laminated it myself at a print shop near my old office. The week
I finished designing that route because I was proud of it. Proud of the fact that I had built something that worked. Something that kept 6 buildings clean and compliant and safe every single night for 8 years without anyone downtown ever having to think about it. Nobody in my family ever asked me about that card. Nobody ever noticed the initials in the corner. It sat in a drawer at the office for years, useful and invisible, exactly the way I had been. When I cleaned out my desk the day after I handed in my resignation, that card was the one thing I made sure to take with me. Before the binder, before the printed emails, before anything else. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it was proof, in my own handwriting, that I had built something real, something that worked, long before anyone bothered to ask who was responsible for it. I keep it on the corner of my desk now, in my new home office, propped against a small stack of client folders, none of which have anyone else's last name attached to them but mine. Sometimes, when a new consulting client asks me how I learned to build systems this precise, I show it to them. This small laminated card with the faded initials in the corner, and I tell them the truth. I learned it by being the only one who noticed the details mattered. For 11 years, in a room full of people who didn't. It doesn't need an apology attached to it to mean what it means. It just needs to still be here, in my handwriting, on my desk, saying quietly that I was the one who kept it running the whole time.